And I just want to say hello to everyone and thank you all for coming via Zoom to our annual Lunch and Learn series for 2021. Today we're going to do Heat Hardy Perennials with Jason Powell, owner of the Jemison-based plant nursery Petals from the Past. And as always, our Lunch and Learn series is hosted by the Friends of Birmingham Botanical Gardens. And it is presented in partnership with the Alabama Cooperative Extension System, the Alabama Green Industry Training Center, the Jefferson County Department of Health, Jefferson County Commission, City of Leeds, Alabama, City of Birmingham Stormwater Management, and the Stormwater Management Authority, Incorporated. And at this time, I'm going to mute myself and turn it over to John Neighbors, who is with Alabama Green Industry, and he's going to tell you a little bit about them and then also introduce Jason for you all.
Well, good morning, everyone. Glad to be here at the 2021 Lunch and Learn series. It's hard to believe it's this will be over halfway mark. So we're glad to have Jason here with us too. Work for the Alabama Extension and the green industry across the state and provide training, whether it's pesticide safety, business related or safety skills on that. So for Alabama Extension and be a part of the team and help improve the professionalism of the industry. Today we've got Jason Powell, well known. We're glad you're here with us today, Jason. Petals of the Past, a 25-acre operation in Jemison, where he and his wife Shelly offer heirloom roses, grandmas, garden shrubs, perennials, and fruit trees. If you've never been by out there, it's a great stopover point and acquire some plants and learn a few things. They've been an educational resource for gardeners for years, and they offer seminars and classes throughout the years, as well as guided tours in the nursery. It's just a great facility to learn about plants, experience horticulture out in their nursery. Jason's father, Dr. Arlie Powell, is involved also with Petals in the Past, primarily with the fruit tree aspect, and his mother involved helping out with the plant propagation. Jason grew up in Auburn and earned a degree in landscaping at Auburn University, received his master's degree in horticulture from Texas A&M. So out there covering the gamut there. And while Jason was at Texas A&M, he worked with Dr. Bill Welch, who specialized in antique roses and heirloom gardening, which is where I believe picked up a love of antique roses there. He's also served as past president of the Alabama Nursery and Landscape Association, and a superstar supporter of our industry. And for that, we can't be thankful enough. And we really appreciate everything that Jason has brought to the table, both in the business world and improving our industry, and also serving to educate others about the horticulture sector. So without that, everybody's here to hear Jason, and so we appreciate your time today, Jason, and thanks for being with us. We'll let you get started.
Hey, John, my pleasure. And Dawn, thank you all so much for the invitation. I've been looking forward to speaking with you, and I love these lunch and learn opportunities, and we are grateful, of course, for what the Botanical Gardens is offering and for what the Alabama Green Industry Training Center is offering. It's helping both our industry, but also helping all of us as gardeners. And as John mentioned, our approach from day one has been to try to approach gardening from an educational standpoint. And the two main efforts that we're trying to achieve that goal is by planting what we're growing in a garden setting. If we were all at the nursery today, one of the things I would want us to do is to walk through and look at what's in bloom, what's at what stage, whether it's a shrub, whether it's a perennial, whether it's an old garden rose. I think it's always better if you can see it in someone's garden, and then you can see how tall it gets, you can see how wide it gets, you can see what it looks like in our landscape with no irrigation system set up. Our soil is not much different from where you garden for certain. We have red clay and rock, and so one of the big missing aspects of our soil is organic matter. And so when we look to plant in our area, which we have, oh gosh, over the last 27 26, 27 years, we're looking at how can we amend and condition that soil. Our pH, anywhere you take a soil test, is going to be around 5.3. So we know with our perennials preferring a pH somewhere between 6 and 7, that about every 3 years we have to add more lime. Every time we go to the garden to plant something, we've got a bag of black cow compost manure under our arms. In fact, I have kidded those folks at Black Cow that I feel like my picture should be on the page of the website for Black Cow composted manure, and then you will have made it in your career when you can get your picture on the cow manure website for sure. But as John mentioned, our approach to gardening is that from an educational standpoint. And first, we plant everything we grow in a garden setting, and then secondly, we host workshops and classes, and we were very, very excited to be able to get back into those classes this year. We try to cover a wide variety of topics. And I don't think it will surprise anybody in the group today, but we have 3 primary areas that continue to be at the top of the list of interest from gardeners. Number 1 is edibles. We're hearing from gardeners every week, practically every other day, that we're talking to about vegetables or fruit or herbs, something that they can incorporate into their garden that would allow them to eat or enjoy it in the kitchen. The second largest topic we're getting requests for, interestingly, is southeastern native plants. And that's been very, very encouraging. In fact, that has really forced us to create a whole other section devoted just to those southeastern native plants. And then the third category, again, it goes hand in hand with the 2 prior, and that is pollinators. We're talking to gardeners every single day that want to put something in their garden that is not only beautiful and tough, but beneficial to our pollinators. And all 3 of these categories, to me, make sense. And it also, I think, makes it as exciting a time to be in our industry right now as it was 27 years ago when we started. And so again, our focus is on the educational approach. And what I was hoping to talk with you this morning about are some of the toughest perennials that we're finding, not only heat tolerance, but for longevity, whether you've got sun or whether you've got shade. And I wanted to start with a few shots of how perennials are used. Many of you are probably already quite familiar with perennials, but if you're not, I want to show just a few introductory slides that can illustrate some of the uses that we have for perennials in a garden. I would say continually the most popular style of garden that we see perennials used in is a cottage style of garden. And with a cottage style of garden, it basically incorporates everything. In this shot right here in the far distance, those are actually apple trees that are at the far end of the landscape. The turf grass allows you to have easy access from the steps of the patio, walking out to those apples. But when you look to your right, the real highlight of this garden is that long perennial border or mixed border. And this would be referred to as a cottage style of garden because it can incorporate shrubs, it can incorporate perennials, it can incorporate bulbs, reseeding annuals, certainly vegetable plants you can incorporate in there as well. But the overall appearance is basically just, I like to describe it as organized chaos. And what I like about a cottage style of garden is that when you have so many different types of plants, perennials, shrubs, roses, annuals, it's constantly changing. And when one plant is all the focus or 2 plants are all the focus, it takes the attention toward them. And then as they fade into the background, we have something else going on. So perennials play a big, big role in the cottage garden. And that's a style of garden that we kind of inherited from Europe. Now, perennial borders, which are an offshoot of the cottage garden, are a natural approach. This is a garden right here in Birmingham that we love to work with. And if you see some of the elements that are part of this garden are things that you can incorporate quite readily. You can see the turf grass leading in this instance to the path. The pathway is a nice winding pathway from the house to an outdoor structure. And what it allows us to do is create a space for planting that's about 5 to 6 feet wide. And then it is lengthwise, it continues all the way down the line. And so we love this perennial border. And in this border, you may recognize some of those plants. Rosemary toward the foreground, incorporated with purple coneflower. And then toward the foreground, we see some of the zinnias that are spilling over. And in the far distance, there's a crabapple. And of course, right in front of that, you can see some cannas. So a perennial border, a natural way to use, to certainly use perennials in the landscape as well. This is just a cutout. You could take your turf grass, do a perennial bed, just cut those guys right out. This one's featuring, of course, black-eyed Susans right in here, pretty prominent. This is a nice perennial or mixed border. A mixed border just means we're incorporating shrubs as well as perennials. And when you look here, we're in South Texas in this shot. And so you can keep in mind, these perennials right here are going to be able to handle the heat and the humidity. A couple of them I wanted to point out. This one right here in the corner with the red blooms toward the foreground is an old-fashioned southwestern native that we can grow very, very readily here, and that is Turks cap. Malva viscous is the genus, and Turks cap is one tough customer. You do not have to pamper that guy. Toward the foreground, I think everybody would recognize the black-eyed Susan. This particular variety is a selection called Goldstrom, and Goldstrom is one tough customer, no two ways about it. Going on further down in the foreground, you've got a salvia here. This is one of the lighter colored foliages that has blue blooms on top of that yellow foliage. In the background behind it, the big bold texture of this particular perennial is an Allocasia, which is kind of an elephant ear. But again, in the background and in the height, we've got Yopon hollies, a good southern native, and that gives us a little bit of height. But the color and the texture that is offered to us through the use of perennials is difficult to beat. And what our goal is to allow each perennial to occupy a certain amount of space. And if it outgrows that space, then we can divide it. And that's the beauty of having these perennials, thankfully, is you do not have to replace them each year. This is something that's going to come back for us that we can add to, or if it becomes too much of a good thing, we can divide it. Now we go a little further south. We're in Wetumpka, Alabama, with this planting, and this is in just in Elmore County, and metal building that they use for a meeting facility. And previously it had been just probably about 5 or 6 Yopon hollies that were just pruned, annually into little round shapes. And they decided they wanted to put a pollinator garden in here. Well, as they brought out the stone and outlined their bed, it in essence is creating an herbaceous border or perennial border. An herbaceous border just means that everything that we're using in here has a softer stem. It's going to freeze to the ground in the winter, and then it's going to come right back from the base in the spring. And so as we're looking in this garden, we're seeing, of course, that same variety. That's the black-eyed Susan called Goldstrom. We get that same daisy-shaped bloom from purple coneflower, one of our reliable perennials. And then you go continue on forward, and you've got this particular Shasta. This is a Shasta daisy called Becky. And Becky can easily get 2.5 feet tall. It's a wonderful spring bloomer into early summer, handles the heat brilliantly, and the foliage is evergreen. As we continue on toward the door, there's some spikes right in here that I hope you can see. There's one of them leaning over the rock wall here, and those are the spikes of another southeastern native perennial called Liatris. Liatris, Liatris, or the common name is spiked gayfeather. That's a wonderful drought-tolerant, heat-tolerant perennial. This perennial border right here is getting at least 6 hours of sunlight, so everything in there would love to have the more sun, the better. And then as we get right to the very edge, you can see the beautiful purple globe-shaped blooms that are spilling over the edge. That's a verbena, and that particular selection is called Homestead Purple, verbena Homestead Purple. And then in the background, you can see a little bit of a mixture of the reseeding annuals. These are the old-fashioned zinnias. So in this bed, we're relying almost entirely upon perennial plants. And in the spaces, we've got a few mixed in reseeding annuals like the tall zinnias. We're back in Birmingham now for this particular garden. And this homeowner has a beautiful brick home. And they wanted to do a non-traditional foundation planting. And so right here in the foreground, we're looking at one of the cherry trees, actually one of the ornamental, fruiting cherry trees. And as a background, you've got a dwarf butterfly bush behind it. Over toward the house near the gutter downspout, I think one of the very best of the tall black-eyed Susans. This is a variety called Herbstone, Herbstone. Herbstone is wonderful for about a 4 to 5 foot perennial black-eyed Susan that does not need staking. It stands up on its own 2 feet. One of the features I like is from the edge of this house to this fence is only about 7 to 8 feet. And then beyond this fence, it just drops straight down. So they made the very most of this area by putting in a pathway. And rather than having to take a mower down through there, they used perennials and herbs on both the left and right-hand side of the walkway. And in between those stepping stones, we've just got a nice elfin thyme planted. The thyme is called elfin, E-L-F-I-N. Love that guy. And again, so a nice mixed border that we're using as a foundation planting, which gives you something non-traditional if you want to move away from just standard shrubs up against the house. And I don't want you to forget, last but not least, perennials in containers. Obviously, this is an agave here, and it's featured in this little perennial border here in Jemison at our display gardens. In the foreground, we're looking at a little blackfoot daisy, which is kind of iffy on the cold hardiness. And then over here, we're looking at one of the other tall salvias. This is a nice variety of Farinaceous salvia called Henry Dewberg. And so when we talk about perennials, I want to mention just a couple of 3 definitions. Many of you will already be familiar with the definition of a perennial, but typically what we stick with in the industry is any plant that returns from the crown for 3 years or more is considered a perennial. And from the crown of the plant, that's just the growth point at which new growth emerges. So you could include a shrub, you could include a tree, all of the above would be considered perennials. But for our purposes for this discussion, I wanted to talk about those that have more herbaceous stems. Some of them will be evergreen during the winter. Some of them are going to die all the way back, freezing to the ground in the winter, and then return from the base in the spring. And so with this discussion, one of the ways that we can determine what's going to be perennial in our area versus what's going to be perennial in other areas is by the cold hardiness zone. And many of you will be familiar already with the USDA cold hardiness zone, but it's one of the ways that it's easier for us to determine, is that plant going to make it through the winter? And so we're considered, as you are, a cold hardiness zone 8. And that just has our minimum temperatures that it deals with. And it unfortunately doesn't talk about the heat. How much heat can they take? So typically when you're in a nursery and you're looking at cold hardiness zones, or if it just says zones, as long as that zone number is 8 or 7 or 6 or 5, you've got no worries. It's going to be cold hardy for you. When we start looking at those cold hardiness zones of 9 and 10, of course, those guys typically are not going to make it through the winter for us. We can still use them in the garden, but we would put them into the category of annual. And you remember, annual is a plant that's going to conduct its life cycle all in one season. So it'll germinate from seed, it'll flower and die all in one season. Not necessarily 1 year, but all in one season. And so typically annuals are divided into heat tolerant and cold tolerant annuals. Of course, our favorite cold tolerant annuals typically are pansies and violas. Heat tolerant annuals, of course, you're looking at right now, the zinnias, the petunias, marigolds, all of the above. So for our discussion, talking about perennials, we're talking about plants that have to come back a minimum of 3 years or more. We're talking specifically about primarily herbaceous perennials. And we're looking at kind of how we can use them in a landscape. This is a shadier landscape here, and it's a stone wall here at Lake Martin. And what we're using are, of course, maidenhair ferns in between those stacked stones. And then as you come up here, you've got the taller fern. This particular one is one of the Liatris, or we often call that southern shield fern. And then right in here, we've got some shade tolerance with one of the oriental lilies. This particular variety is called Casablanca. It's a nice white Asiatic lily. I typically grow that in more sun, and I was pretty surprised at how well it could do with dappled light in this landscape. And then one other way we've used perennials, certainly with wildflowers and creating a meadow like this. This one's heavily dependent upon black-eyed Susans. Over in this far corner to the right, we're looking at spotted bee balm, which is a wonderful, nice perennial. And then we've got the taller forms of black-eyed Susans back here, some of those prairie coneflowers, and little Queen Anne's lace over here. So many of these plants behave as a perennial root system coming back every year and have filled this area in. And that area previously had been all turf grass. So your maintenance really dropped pretty significantly when you go to a meadow. And with this being all plants, many of which are in the aster family, that's a big, big calling card for pollinators. And with it being perennial, we see those same bees, families of bees and butterflies returning every year because they know this area. They know those plants are going to be there. They know they can count on that for pollen and nectar. And so it's a nice way to create a good pollinator destination in your landscape with a wildflower type meadow. We'll jump in. We'll start with the sun-tolerant perennials, and then we'll jump into the shade-tolerant perennials. But I wanted to mention them kind of by their season of bloom. Sweet William is kind of a famous old-fashioned form of Dianthus. If you've not grown this one, it is an evergreen perennial. Sweet William has a nice fragrance or aroma. We typically see them with pinks and purples, occasionally whites, but these flower at a height of around 2 to 2.5 feet tall with no staking required. And they flower in the spring. They make a great show. They typically are following the spring blooms of our other forms of Dianthus, but this is Dianthus barbatus or Sweet William. Nice fragrance, round-shaped bloom, good spring bloomer, and it can handle any heat you throw at it, for sure. The other perennial category we're going to talk a lot about, there's 3 of them. We're going to talk a lot about Dianthus. We'll talk a lot about Phlox, different forms of it, and we'll talk a lot about Salvia as well. This particular perennial I'm a big fan of, the whole genus. This is Phlox, and Thrift is the common name. Thrift, many of you will be familiar with. You probably think of it as pink like I do, but there are blues, there are whites, there are reds as well. It's a nice low-growing perennial. Height-wise, we're looking at 4 to 6 inches, something in that range. It is also evergreen for us in the landscape. And as it spreads, it will root wherever it lays its head down. So it's a nice low-growing perennial, good spring flowering, and then foliage thereafter. Another good low front of the border perennial for those sunny borders. We really are pleased with how well some of the selections of candy tuft are doing in the landscape. This is another perennial that is evergreen during the winter, reaching a height of 8 to 12 inches, and it clumps nicely, but it has super fragrant blooms starting as early as February. So this candy tuft typically is blooming for us February, March, into April, and then when it gets a little too warm for it in April, it slows down its bloom sequence, but it continues to maintain that foliage. Candy tuft is, again, a nice, fragrant, tough, low-growing perennial, handles the sun beautifully. And now we're back to Dianthus. We started out with, you remember, Sweet William at a little bit taller height. Well, the Dianthus, like these guys, the Gratianopolis and some of these other forms of low-growing Dianthus, can perform a wonderful function, more of a ground cover growth habit like the creeping phlox. Dianthus fire witch is nice because it flowers at a with fragrance at a height of about 6 to 8 inches. I love the bluish green cast to the foliage, and that stays with us through the winter. And what's unique about fire witch is that it is also a repeat flowering form of Dianthus. So with this low-growing perennial, we get a huge spring show. The flowers will cover the entire foliage throughout the rest of the summer and then into the fall. And then it's just foliage thereafter. But a nice fragrance, super drought-tolerant, low-growing evergreen perennial for the sun. Again, about 6 to 8 inches. All right, now we talked about Thrift as Phlox subulata, one of the creeping forms of Phlox. We jump now to its cousin, sometimes called Wild Sweet William. This is one of the Phlox Paniculatas. These are the tall, old-fashioned garden phlox that our grandmothers grew. This is a wonderful, wonderful, fragrant phlox. They're blooming now. So we get May, June into the 1st of July with these old-fashioned phloxes. Again, Phlox Paniculata. So we're looking at 2.5 feet in height. This particular selection is an old-fashioned form, just called common purple. But with the old garden phlox, you've got wonderful whites like David. We've got white with a pink eye like John Fennick. There's tons of varieties. But what we're looking for are those varieties that have the best resistance to powdery mildew. And a couple of things that we do that I think are helping is we got plenty of sun. We don't have heavy irrigation on these guys. It's rainfall only, and plenty of sunshine. I think that helps them to keep them out of that powdery mildew for sure. Another shape bloom and an interesting foliage for a nice texture in the perennial garden are all of the forms of yarrow. Achillea Filipendulina is the genus for this particular group of perennials, but there's tons of varieties. Yarrow, we're always a little bit scared of because it can be aggressive, but these selections like paprika are much, much more mannerly. This one gets about 1.5 feet, maybe 18 to 24 inches tall max, and it has this nice umbel-shaped bloom, a lot like Queen Anne's lace, but with paprika, you get more toward a red. And I love that fern-like foliage. Thankfully, this is a perennial that we've had great success with in full blazing sun. Doesn't tend to wilt down and does not need an irrigation system. It clumps nicely, but not aggressively. So yarrow, varieties like paprika. There's a wonderful yellow called moonshine. I would encourage you to kind of check out some of those guys as well. And you can't have any discussion of sun-tolerant perennials without talking about this old-fashioned favorite. And when you get to the category of iris, there are so many different types of iris. You want to be kind of careful and selective. The bearded iris are also sometimes called German iris. Their botanical name is Iris germanica. And these are the ones that our grandmothers would have passed along that grow with these sword-like leaves, and they're evergreen during the winter. They are exceptionally drought tolerant. They do not like a lot of moisture. They don't like a lot of water. So the height of these iris will vary a little bit, but typically bearded iris are around 2 to 3 feet tall with those spikes of bloom. The foliage is a brilliant bluish green, and they like to grow right on the top of the soil, that rhizome right near the top of it. And every few years, as they multiply, it is very beneficial to divide those guys so that they don't kind of bury themselves in the garden. This is another one as we're moving on into the late spring, summer garden. Nymphaphia uvaria, or red hot poker. If you've got a sunny, drier spot, this is one I want you to consider, especially if you need a little bit of height. The flower spikes on this red hot poker can get upwards of 3 to 3.5 feet, somewhere in that range. If you're a cut flower ranger, this is because you've got a super cut flower opportunity. But the drought tolerance on this particular perennial is amazing. And again, within our irrigation, within our landscape, we do not use an irrigation system on these perennials, so we like the fact that they can handle the drought without any problem. This particular perennial has been in that same spot now going on about 15 years. So it's made it through several droughts, including the 100-year drought back in 2007. It's handled it with no trouble, thankfully, whatsoever. As we're talking about drought-tolerant perennials, though, and that can handle the heat, this is one that Shelley collected in New Braunfels, Texas, and it's called Texas Square Bud Primrose. You can see the botanical name there. Traditionally, primroses were all in the Oenothera genus, but this is Calliphus, and this is a amazing perennial. This one absolutely is in our top 5 category of drought-tolerant perennials. The characteristics of this particular one is that it's evergreen. It flowers with those beautiful yellow blooms spring, summer, and fall. And it doesn't mind a slightly higher pH. It can handle our acidic pHs, but the area that Shelley collected it from is primarily calcareous soil, so a little bit higher pH. but this is an awesome, awesome perennial. Again, evergreen during the winter and flowers spring, summer, and fall. Height-wise, though, we're only talking about maybe 8 inches, something in that range. In this particular arrangement, I wanted you to see, we have planted it. Our traditional approach to using perennials in the garden is we like to use them in 3s or 5s, odd numbers. And if you see here, you can kind of see the rounded out portion. These 3 plants of square bud primrose were planted probably 8 months prior to this photograph being taken, and they were planted about 12 inches from the center of one plant to the other in kind of a triangular fashion. And that's the approach we like to use with perennials. One of the nice things about them is that by planting them in a grouping like this with 3 or 5 or 7, you allow them to grow together to be one big drift. Whereas with shrubs and trees, we want them to have their own individual space. This is a nice way to get your perennials started with odd numbers, just from a design standpoint. You can see that square bud primrose now in another place in the garden where it's been allowed to spill over. And again, that particular clump of perennials is about a year older than the one we were just looking at. And when you look at it, it just looks like one big mass, thankfully. Behind it, there's a little wildflower. You can see the blues, and in the foreground, pardon me, those blues are a little wildflower called baby blue eyes. And then the rose directly behind it is one of the old garden roses called Lamarne. Lamarne gets about 3 feet to 4 feet tall and about that wide. But again, that square bud primrose is spring, summer, and fall. We jump in while we're talking about sun tolerant perennials. My absolutely favorite category of perennial to talk about would be salvias. If you have a half a day of sun or more, particularly afternoon sun, please consider growing as many of the perennial forms of salvia as you can. You will grow some beautiful perennials that can return for you each year, but they are one of the most drought tolerant species of perennial that you can grow. The butterflies and hummingbirds and bees are absolutely enamored with any of the salvias that we grow, but deer don't eat them. And that's always a big factor for us. We're looking for what can we get for the pollinators that the deer don't eat, and salvias fit the bill. This is mealy cup sage, or Salvia farinaceae, and wonderful perennial. It's going to reach about 3 to 3.5 feet in height, and it'll flower spring, summer, and fall. Another of the perennial salvias. Oh, sorry. Let me go back to that one. The one we're looking at here, this is Salvia latrinidad, and it actually has green foliage during the winter, and it flowers at a height of about 12 to 18 inches, somewhere in that range. And it flowers beginning in March. It starts earlier because it's evergreen during the winter, and it'll flower all the way to frost. Salvia gregias are sometimes called Texas sages. We love these guys. These are a little bit taller. They're more in that 2 to 2.5 foot category. They're going to bloom also, though, spring, summer, fall. They're evergreen during the winter as well. And again, pick a color. The Salvia gregias come in every color imaginable. Purple coneflower, we mentioned it earlier in the perennial borders. This one's a tough plant. I can't have a perennial garden without my purple coneflowers. This is just the straight native species, Echinacea purpurea, about 2 feet to 2.5 feet in height. Flowers during the late spring or on into summer. Wonderful perennial for us to work with for the sunny spots. We don't want to forget Coreopsis. And again, Coreopsis is another large genus. This particular variety is a thin leaf form called moonbeam. Really a nice 2.5 foot tall perennial that blooms spring, and then we cut the spent blooms, it blooms summer. We cut the spent blooms and it blooms fall. I want to mention as a perennial in particular the Gara, and the Gara is in the background. It's the smaller spikes of white blooms. In the foreground is Melampodium, and Melampodium we're finding is just not cold hardy enough to make it through our winters, but the Gara is not only cold hardy enough, it's drought tolerant enough that it can handle whatever you throw at it. And Gara, this particular white selection, is about a 2.5 foot tall perennial, occasionally making it to 3 feet. And every time it finishes a sequence of bloom, if I cut it down low, it'll continue blooming. So it's spring, summer, and fall. And then getting into the fall for that sunny spot in the garden, please consider some of the old-fashioned chrysanthemums, what we will sometimes call Chrysanthemum Morifolium, or just old-fashioned mums. These are the October daisies or single petal chrysanthemums. They're going to range in height from Ryan's pink, which is 18 to 24 inches, on down to the cream form, which are 12 to 15 inches. But they'll start blooming in August and go right on into October. And they multiply quite readily, come back every year without any trouble. And they're going to overlap nicely in September, October with the asters. They've changed the botanical name of the asters to Symphyotrichums. And I love this cluster. This is in a Columbus, Georgia garden. And we're looking at the smooth aster at about 3 feet in height. And then right next to that wall where it can just spill right over. The bees went crazy over that one for sure. So asters as well as chrysanthemums are going to give us a nice fall bloom. And I just like lamb's ear for foliage. This one's a tough one to beat. If you've got a half a day of sun or more, this is going to be a nice perennial that can soften the front edge of a border for sure. And then kind of a combination here, we're seeing the red form of verbena, the Taylor's red, the hot lip salvia, a nice backdrop of red cascade rose there. I like that shot for sure. But if you've got shade, I want to mention a few. And again, we're going through the season. Perennials, if you've got a shade garden and you could only have one perennial, this is the perennial I would encourage you to look at. Hellebores or Hellebores orientalis, evergreen foliage during the winter, and these flowers. With hellebores, you can get white, you can get purple, you can get pink, you can get all sorts of colors. But what you have in this particular perennial is a height of about 15 to 24 inches, somewhere in that range. You have evergreen foliage. This is a drought-tolerant perennial that deer do not like. And so it's a really, really nice 12 months of interest plant. And when it's happy, many of the varieties will go to seed like this one has, and then they'll start dropping those new ones right there at the base. Along next to it, I oftentimes will use a perennial like Solomon seal. Solomon seal is a nice rhizomatous type of growth habit like iris, but it has this particular one has a variegated foliage. So we get white and green foliage. We have these wonderful white blooms in the spring, height-wise about 18 inches tall, and it colonizes. So it grows very, very nicely in our shade gardens. It is herbaceous. So it'll freeze through the ground in the winter, and then it comes back from the base in the spring. Another one, we think about iris typically for sun gardens, but Iris tectorum, or the Japanese roof iris, is a particularly nice shade-tolerant iris that is evergreen during the winter, but only gets about 12 to 15 inches tall. Multiplies quite readily, and you'll find Japanese roof iris both in blue and white. I love this blue in the garden. This particular one is a hardy plumbago, and it's not a true plumbago at all. It's ceratostigma, but it's completely cold hardy in our area, and as a low-growing ground cover, can offer us not only foliage and something that can cover the soil and keep the weeds out, but it blooms off and on spring, summer, and fall with this brilliant, brilliant dark blue color. So hardy blue plumbago, shade, it can also go into sun, no problem. I love this guy. I'm just finishing a nice sequence of bloom on this perennial bear's breeches. This is Acanthus mollis, large evergreen foliage for us, spikes of bloom that can go up to a height of 4 feet easily. This is a perennial that's really, really nice. A little bit of morning sun will help with more bloom, but must have that afternoon shade with bear's breeches or acanthus, but excellent drought tolerance. And then in the foreground, we talked about creeping phlox and old garden phlox for the sunnier area. If you've got the shade, you're not limited. You can grow some of the Phlox pilosa and some of the Louisiana phloxes, both of which are native to the Southeast and lower growing and spring blooming. So keep in mind the creeping forms of phlox. We've got some for sun, got some for shade as well. You're not limited. Another good Southeastern native, in the background, you can see the oak leaf hydrangea getting ready to bloom. And in the foreground, this is our native columbine. Columbine is an herbaceous perennial that also can reseed itself. Grows in the cracks of rocks, so it's exceptionally drought tolerant and offers us a really, really good nectar plant for our early hummingbirds. Heucheras And I want to look at the next slide we'll jump to as well. Heucheras are now, thankfully, they're starting to introduce varieties that are more uniquely southern tolerant. They can handle our heat, but must have the shade for certain. This is Purple Palace. And the heucheras are wonderful for us both in containers as well as in the ground. But the foliage reaches about 12 to 15 inches in height. They will bloom, but you're really growing it more for the foliage than the bloom. And Tiarella, I think, is really, really worth considering as well. This is a wonderful southeastern native. They call it foam flower. These wonderful white spikes of bloom are nice, but the foliage is what we're really growing both Tiarella and heucheras for. And it's evergreen during the winter, gives us a beautiful bloom in the spring, and then they clump very, very readily. Now, a couple of exciting things that are occurring is a lot of breeders are breeding and crossing the heucheras with the Tiarellas, and we're ending up with some really good selections that are now referred to as heucherellas. And those are ones I would encourage you to please consider for the shade garden, whether it's in a container or in the landscape as well. And of course, you hear all the time, if you're a shade gardener, you hear lots about hostas and ferns. I want to just show one of my favorites. This is Japanese painted fern, one of the ethereums that just has almost a metallic type of appearance. And that Japanese painted fern only gets a height of about 15, 18 inches, somewhere in that range. It's great in a container or in the landscape. And then for another good evergreen foliage, a little bit of morning sun is okay, but the cranesbill geraniums are pretty doggone hard to beat. They flower early in the spring, their foliage is evergreen, and they clump nicely. They don't like a lot of water, for sure. And then again, just one last shot, some hostas and some hellebores that we're looking at here. You're gonna hear about hostas all the time when you're in the shade garden, but please do keep in mind those hellebores is a nice addition as well. And that's the last slide. This is just a few of the reseeding annuals of zinnias that I wanted to mention. And then I wanted to make sure we left some time in here for questions. Dawn, if there's any questions or something we can tackle, I would love to try to tackle those guys now.
All right, I am going back in the chat and I'm going to give you the questions as I see them.
Okay.
So the first question is about Mexican petunias. What about them?
Yeah, Mexican petunias would definitely qualify as both a shade or a sun-tolerant perennial. Those guys are pretty phenomenal. The biggest complaint we have with Mexican petunias is their vigorous nature. They multiply quite readily, and they'll grow in wet, they'll grow in dry, they'll grow in full blazing sun. The biggest key, and they flower throughout the heat of the summer and right on into fall, but just be careful in the area that you put them in that you limit how much space you want them to have, because they'll take a lot.
Is an encore azalea considered a perennial?
You know, for any discussion, when you look at the strict definition of perennial, that it's a plant that returns from the crown 3 years or more, shrubs and trees, including encore azaleas, would be considered perennials. But normally, when you're discussing them in a garden type setting, that people are talking about perennials, they're thinking of perennials that make an herbaceous stem, something that's flexible, doesn't get quite as thick, and that oftentimes freezes to the ground in the winter and then comes back from the base in the spring. So definitely by just strict definition, you could consider it a perennial, but most of the time, you would think of encore azalea as a shrub, botanically.
All right, is a Helleborus orientalis a Lenten rose? Or did I say that wrong?
Yes, it is. You said it just right. Helleborus orientalis. That is definitely a Lenten rose. And then you've got other forms of hellebores like Niger. That's a Christmas rose. So all the hellebores are really, really good for us in the Birmingham area to work with.
Do you do any consultations?
We do, but right now, the growth direction we've gone in every route, we're doing our consultations only at the nursery. We're not able to I'm afraid we can't get caught up far enough to be able to get outside and do consultations in others' gardens.
Okay, Molly Hendry, who is on staff at the gardens, wanted to know if you have suggestions for late blooming perennials in the shade.
Let's see. Yes, yes. I want you to consider turtle head. I didn't have a picture of it, but Chelone, Chelone. Turtle head is a really, that's the common name, and Chelone obliqua is the botanical name. That's a really nice late summer, early fall blooming perennial for the shade. Good height. Most of the colors I'm seeing in that are pink. And then you got to have some toad lilies in your garden for that late summer, early fall bloom for the shade. Toad lilies, you can get beautiful foliage, and then the flowers look like orchids almost. And then some of the gingers are actually showing us some shade tolerance as well, and those are late summer, early fall blooming as well. So I would definitely include turtle head. I would include the toad lilies, and I would include some of the gingers.
Okay. I'm not sure if I'm going to say this correct, but someone said their agapanthus won't bloom.
Right. Agapanthus is a nice perennial. They call it lily of the Nile, and we see it used frequently along the coast. I mean, it is so heat tolerant. It's tolerant of being root bound, but there's tons of varieties. And some of the varieties have got excellent cold tolerance, some of them not so much. But what we have found that perennial likes is it really likes to be root bound. It typically doesn't bloom the first or second year in the landscape. It'll take it several more years. It wants to be nice and thick and full. And if it's getting less than 6 or 7 hours of sunlight, I don't think you're going to get it to bloom.
What is the best way to plant and grow reseeding zinnias?
Reseeding zinnias for us, if you're going to do them in an open area, like the picture here, that's inside of our vegetable garden, and we've just devoted one whole quadrant to it. So that's so easy because you can rake it smooth, pull the weeds out, and I can literally throw the seed out on top of the ground like I'm feeding chickens, and in 3 days, they will have germinated. So if you've got an open area, that's the easiest way to do it. If you want to mix these zinnias in with your perennial garden, then you simply start anytime after mid-April, and you can throw these seed right on top of the mulch in and around your perennials, especially if you use a pine bark mulch like we do. And again, 5-6 days after that, you're going to see germination. You thin out the ones you don't want, and you keep the ones that you do.
I planted purple coneflowers and they died. What did I do wrong?
The purple coneflowers, typically, we're seeing a couple of things. The native and the old-fashioned varieties like Magnus are excellent, and some of the newer varieties don't seem to have the same durability, the same endurance. And irrigation is the biggest enemy that purple coneflower has. If you do a lot of watering, or if it was out there in our heavier soils that don't drain so well, if it was out there when we're having these 5- and 6-inch rains, that will typically rot the purple coneflower. So getting good drainage is critical. I think using some of the old-fashioned varieties as well as just the straight native species is a good route to go.
Okay. Zinnia seed question. When the plants drop seed naturally, does it need to be worked into the soil or covered with soil?
No, we have a lot of zinnias that come back every year, thankfully. And we've mulched over them, we've forgotten about them, and thankfully, the old-fashioned zinnias, like these tall ones that are in the photograph, they come back no matter what.
The deer are eating my coneflowers. What can I do?
Yeah, the deer are going to be a big issue. One of the most successful efforts that we've made at keeping deer out of the garden has been to fertilize with a product called milorganite. That's spelled M-I-L-O-R-G-A-N-I-T-E. If you can't physically keep the deer out of the area, try the fertilization with that milorganite. It's a processed sewage sludge, and so it has that aroma, and you're going to smell it for at least 2 days, but the deer will detect it for 4 to 5 weeks. And that has helped us to keep them out of areas that we've planted.
Are zinnias perennials?
No, zinnias are defined as an annual botanically because they'll flower, they'll germinate, flower, and die all in one season.
Okay. Something munches on my purple coneflower and black-eyed Susans. What's best to use that won't harm bees?
We've seen occasionally a little caterpillar that will eat the petals of the coneflower and the black-eyed Susans. And so with those guys, typically they're moving right through. If it's foliage, like lower foliage that it's eating, we've had great success with just diatomaceous earth that we can put down on the ground. So if it's crawling insect, it'll move across that and that knocks it out. And that's a good organic treatment that will not be harmful to your bees for certain. And so if it's a ground pest, that's a little easier to deal with. If it's a flying pest, that's much more difficult because when we're spraying, if we're using a pesticide, we're going to definitely have an impact on the bees.
Someone asked if you could repeat the fertilizer that you suggested to keep deer away.
Oh yeah, Milorganite. It's spelled Milorganite. And Milorganite is a really nice, gosh, it's of course considered an organic fertilizer. You're not going to have trouble finding it. You can find it at local nurseries. We certainly carry it. You can find it at the big box stores. But Milorganite, really, really a solid fertilizer, and it's one the American Rose Society put their stamp of approval on and recommended as a deer deterrent for roses.
All right, I'm gonna go to the question chat for a minute and answer those questions and then come back to our chat questions. Right. Where do you suggest we find these plants around Birmingham?
Well, I will tell you, we've with perennials, we're seeing more and more nurseries that are absolutely stepping up and carrying a good mixture. So we've of course with herbaceous perennials, we've seen we would always want to encourage you to check your local independent nurseries, and I think Birmingham has got probably the best selection of independent nurseries surrounding them, for everybody from Collier's Nursery to Sweet Peas to oh gosh, out to Hannah's 280 Garden Shop. We would love for you, of course, to come see us in Jemison. We're about a 40-minute ride from you, 45 minutes, depending on where you're coming from. But more and more of the independent nurseries are starting to branch into and carry perennials, so that you're going to see a better selection. Call them before you go. That way you can find out what their selection is. June is National Perennial Month, so that's when we typically see nurseries carrying a lot of those guys as well. We love to encourage people to plant them during the summertime because you can kind of see what you're working with. And you'll find a lot of times at nurseries, including ours, you're going to find sales on perennials. We're doing perennials, buy two and get one free right now to encourage people to plant them in threes. So I would get out and about, call your local nurseries, especially your independent nurseries. I think you'll see more selection.
And if you are a member of the Gardens, you actually get 10% off regularly priced purchases at Petals from the Past, along with a couple of other local flower shops in the area. So check that out on our webpage. If you're a member of Birmingham Botanical Gardens, you get 10% off regularly priced purchases at Petals from the Past.
That's right. That's right.
Okay. Back to some more questions. I was surprised to hear that plumbago grows in shade. I always thought that this plant thrived in full afternoon sun.
That's exactly right. We're talking about two different plumbagos. So the plumbago that we showed in our picture is a ground cover, and it's not true plumbago. It's called ceratostigma, and it's a different ground cover. But you know how common names are. Typically with perennials, with any plant, pardon me, you can have multiple common names, but only one botanical name. So the plumbago that we were talking about is not true plumbago. It's a shade-tolerant ground cover. But the plumbago that you're thinking of, definitely the light blue flower, it's full sun. Unfortunately, not cold hardy for us here, but definitely worth having in the garden every year.
Okay. Hannah asked if she heard you say that you needed to whack back guara after bloom for rebloom.
Definitely. Gora has got those wonderful long spikes, and it gives you that airy feel in the landscape. Well, what will happen is it'll put on this massive flush of bloom. And as that massive flush of bloom is slowing down and stopping, new spikes are going to be coming up. So cut those old spikes back into the interior of the plant, just clip them away. Or if they haven't spiked it with new ones, just whack it back like you're saying. And then the next sequence of bloom comes on that much faster. And then do it again after the summer flush of bloom. And that way you get your fall flush of bloom. But definitely your best friend in the perennial garden is going to be a good sharp pair of clippers.
We are interested in starting a meadow in a large 10 by 50 foot area near our street that gets afternoon full sun. Where would you start in establishing this? What plants, where to plant to start?
I'd probably, an area that large, I would definitely want to have all of the black-eyed Susans, multiple varieties of black-eyed Susans. I would definitely want to have our native species of purple coneflower. I would definitely want we'd rely a lot on native plants for that meadow garden, like Joe Pye weed. And then we would throw out there, I think, some of the native Texas star hibiscus for a bit of color as well. And so, yeah, Gora that we were just talking about a moment ago is going to fit into that whole theme. So there is a whole selection of not only herbaceous perennials that can be planted, but then I would come back over the top and I would throw seed, wildflower seed in the gaps in between it to allow everything to kind of get established at one time.
Okay. Tabitha is interested particularly in southeastern natives. Do y'all carry those at Petals from the Past?
We have actually put a whole section of the nursery in that's a fairly large area devoted just to southeastern natives. Okay. And our southeastern native person that we all love them, but probably our most knowledgeable, we call her our guru, is at the nursery on Saturdays and Sunday afternoons, if you'd like to talk with her as well.
Riley again wants to know the best way to establish a meadow like you showed in one of the first slides, keeping weeds to a minimum.
Yeah, the first thing is to get rid of the competition. So what you would want to do is outline the area that you want to create the meadow in. You want to get rid of the weed competition, whether you're using hand removal or a pesticide. And then you don't really, if you're starting it from seed, you really don't want to till too terribly deeply. You want to just scratch that soil up so that you'll have good seed to soil contact. And then you want to be able to spread that seed directly on top of that area, moisten it so that you can get germination going, and then get those seeds started as quickly as possible so that you can get ahead of the weeds. If you end up tilling it or having to disc a little bit deeper, wait and let the weeds come back a second time, go back over that again, and then get started with your seed. We know the minute you till or start loosening that soil, the first thing that comes to the surface are going to be the weed seed that have been waiting under that soil, just waiting for sunlight.
Okay. I planted mint for the first time this year next to oregano and chives that come back each year in a planter. The oregano and mint have some type of small insect taking the green out of the leaves. I'm hesitant to spray anything on plants that they will ingest. How do I get rid of these bugs, or should I plant my mint around the corner on the deck this summer to see if it will thrive there?
I would go ahead and just cut the oregano, cut the mint. You can cut all that back and remove the insect and the damage at one time. And I got a feeling you'll have gotten rid of most of your problem. But if not, the nice thing about all of those perennial herbs is that you can use if you feel like there are too many insects in there and you can't keep up with them, there are thankfully multiple organic alternatives to pesticide. But the first thing I would do is cut them back really hard, because mint and oregano both love to be pruned back, and you can cut them back hard and you're likely getting rid of the insect and the damage that it's done at one time. And then fertilize, water, and let the new growth come out fresh.
She also asked if it would help to replace the soil in the planter.
If you're having to, if the roots have, if it's been there probably more than a couple of years, yes, the soil can certainly be a place for the insects to overwinter. But I would be more concerned about the how much moisture you can maintain in there. Mint is so fast, and oregano also, that they may have completely exhausted what soil was there. And if you're having to water more frequently than you can, that's a good indicator it's time to change out that soil.
When do I need to separate my irises that were from my grandmother's garden?
If you will, you divide perennials, including iris, opposite the season that they bloom. So most of the bearded iris are spring bloomers, so we divide them in the fall. If it's bearded iris, they're tough enough. If you have to, you can certainly divide them right now. You're not going to hurt bearded iris for sure.
With wildflower meadows or many of the other beds we've seen today, how do you control weeds? Did you catch that, Jason? How do you control weeds? Oh, sorry. How do you control weeds with wildflower meadows?
The key on wildflower meadows is to grow everything just like in the perennial border. Look in the mixed border, you are you're trying to outcompete the weeds simply by filling every square inch with a perennial or a wildflower. So we know if there are any gaps, any spaces in the garden, that's an opportunity for weeds to come in. So initially we go in, if we're just planting, and we get rid of the competition, whether it's hand removal or a pesticide or herbicide, and then we prepare the soil. And then we typically will wait a week or two, especially if we're doing it from seed, because we know some weed seed are going to come back, and we'll do it again. Then we try to grow everything as thick as possible so that they will actually outcompete the weeds that are trying to come up in there. So it's basically strategy.
Are there any perennials that like shade and soil that does not drain well when it rains?
Yes, for shade tolerant perennials, we typically look, again, you can look at some of the southeastern natives like cardinal flower. That's its native habitat. It loves that moisture, and it's native to the shade. We've grown varieties of carex, which are a ground cover. I particularly like creeping jenny, which is a form of Lizomachia that can grow in shade with wet soil also. And then I was thinking of, oh gosh, there's another lobelia. In addition to cardinal flower, there's a blue flowered form of lobelia that's nice in the shade in wet areas also. Okay. So yeah, you definitely have options.
I have Turks cap, one in shade and one in sun. The sunny location really grows. When is the best time to trim back without hurting the blooms that hummingbirds love so much?
Oh, you won't hurt Turks cap. If it gets to where it's falling over, you just trim it back. And if you have to cut it back hard, no worries. It might take it 3 weeks or so to get back into bloom, but you won't hurt the Turks cap for certain.
All right. I think that's all of our questions. Everyone is just telling you thumbs up. Great job. And they love Petals from the Past and your presentation. I just want to thank you so much for joining us today. I feel like we've been trying to get you for at least 2 years now.
Yay, well, thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome. And don't forget, people, go out, visit Petals from the Past. If you're a member of the gardens, be sure to take your membership card to get your discount. And we just want to thank Jason for presenting today. And I want to thank John for doing the introduction and actually helping us get in contact with Jason today to be our presenter. So I really appreciate all that y'all do. And we will see you all next week for our Lunch and Learn, when the Lunch and Learn is going to be, where did I put my phone? What is the Lunch and Learn going to be next week, y'all?
Stormwater 101.
Yes, so Stormwater 101. So if you're wanting to find out everything you need to know about stormwater with your yard and whatever jurisdiction you live in, please tune in 2 weeks for that, and we'll be happy to let you know all those good things. I see one more question. or no, it's just a thank you. Tabitha says thank you, and she definitely recommends
Okay.
a trip to Petals from the Past.
Oh,
So we will see you all in 2 weeks, everyone.
thank you. Thank you.